Understanding CSS Flexbox is important if you want to make responsive websites. James Maxwell created this course along with some amazing PDF cheat sheets to go along with it.
Flexbox is going to change your perspective about web designing. And again, for the part of our course, I've created 2 beautiful PDF cheat sheets which you can download. These cheat sheets have got every single property that we're about to learn now. One is exclusive for the parent container properties, and the other is exclusive for the child properties. You can use these cheat sheets for your future reference. I highly encourage everyone to follow the video now and then later use the cheat sheets. So let's dive into the concept of Flexbox without any further delay. We're going to create a separate file for this learning purpose so that you can refer the file along with the cheat sheets in the future. Let's quickly set up a HTML file using the emit function. Now, I'm going to teach you guys another emit function to create a container and the children inside it. So we need a div tag with the class container, and then insert a greater than symbol to create a few children inside the container. Let's give the child elements a class called items. So again, we'll have to insert a dot and just type items. And we also want every child element to have a unique number to it. So insert a hyphen, then insert a dollar symbol times 5. This emit function will create a container with 5 items numbered within it. We also want the items to have one unified alias name to them, and we're going to call it as item. So again, insert a dot and just type item. Now hit enter. How simple was that? This might look a little intimidating at the beginning, but once you get used to it out of practice, you won't be able to create HTML containers without these beautiful emit functions. To learn more about these emit functions, you can visit docs.emit.io. Now, before moving to our CSS file, we'll have to fill in the numbers inside our div tag. Let's quickly create a CSS file and link it with a HTML file. Let's begin with the basic resets using the universal selector. So we're going to set the margin to 0, padding to 0, and box sizing to border box. Next, we're going to style a container and the child elements to implement the Flexbox properties. So we're going to target the container now and give it a background color of hash CA and CA, which is a light gray color, and then give it a padding of 10 pixels, then a margin of 50 pixels. Next, we're going to target the item selector and I'm going to give them a background color of hash FF0037, which is a nice red color. And then for the font inside the item, we're going to give them a white color, font size of 35 pixels, a padding of 20 pixels, and a margin of 10 pixels. If you see here, we haven't implemented any Flexbox yet, but we have a gray color container and red color items inside the container. The items could be anything on a real website. It could be the navbar of the website, or few images, paragraphs, or whatever. This video is all about the Flexbox container properties. To enable Flexbox, we'll have to set the display property to flex inside the container. So let's set the display property to flex inside a container. You can already see the magic. Flexbox has reduced our work a lot, as you can see. To create this kind of layout using the float property, position property, and the margin properties, it would have been a tedious process. I would never take that risk personally. Just by setting the display property to flex in the parent container, the child elements had become the flex items. Now, let's talk about the flex direction property. The flex direction property is used to define the direction of the flex items within the container. By default, the flex direction is set to row. When the flex direction is set to row, you see nothing happens. Apart from row, there are few other direction values that will change the direction of the children inside the container. Let's see them one by one. When we change the flex direction to column, you can see the children items are arranged vertically in a column. That's the superpower of Flexbox. By setting the direction to column, we have changed the axis itself. There are two different axes according to Flexbox, the main axis and the cross axis. The axis differs for different directions. For the flex direction set to row, the main axis would be the x-axis. For the flex direction set to column, the main axis would be the y-axis. This concept is nothing related to the Flexbox or web development. This is basic math. To invert the direction of the flex items in either column or row, we can use the column reverse or the row reverse values. When the direction is set to column reverse, you can see the direction of the items are inverted in the y-axis. So the main axis here goes from the bottom to top, where before it was going from the top to bottom. And of course, the numbers are in the reverse order. 5 is in the top and 1 is in the bottom. The same rule applies for row reverse. You can picturize what that one would do. So when I set the flex direction to row reverse, exactly, it stacks the items in the reverse order. Here, the main axis moves from right to left. And the numbers are also in the reverse order. You should always be aware of the main axis. That's really important. Since we have experimented all the possible values for flex direction property, let's set it back to row, which is the default value. We haven't explored much about Flexbox yet, but I'm sure you could understand how much Flexbox is going to help us in the making of a responsive design. Probably when designing for a smaller screen, we can simply set the flex direction to column, which will stack the items one on top of the other. So that's all about the flex direction. Next up, I want to discuss about the justify content property. So remember that the justify content property defines how the flex items should be stacked along the main axis. Let's start with the center value here. Now, automatically, all the flex items are stacked in the center here. Let me zoom in a little bit so you can see things clearly. Right. You can always use the dev tools to inspect the elements. The browser had understood that this div tag is using Flexbox. When you hover over the justify content property, you can see how beautifully Flexbox had calculated the distances and aligned the items in the center. Just imagine if we didn't have Flexbox to create this very simple layout. Well, we should have used the float property. That would have been a real nightmare for us. So, the center value aligns the flex items right in the center of the container. But it does not do anything with the space in between the items. The space between the items is because of the margin value we gave for our item selector. So if we comment this value, you can see our flex items are tightly packed. Let's quickly uncomment this margin and experiment the next value, which is space between. So let's change the justify content to space between. When we set the justify content to space between, you can see that the space between our flex items are evenly distributed. We didn't have to specify any number here, but Flexbox automatically calculates the distance and distributes the items according to the space available. The best part here is when we adjust the size of a browser, the space between our items also adjusts. So that makes it really handy to create a responsive layout. Let's now comment the margin property inside the item selector again, because we're going to explore another value which is similar to the space between called the space around. Changing the justify content to space around, you can see the space around value had created equal amount of space on both the left and the right side of the flex items. The space between these two items is twice the amount of space on the left side of this item. Next up, we're going to see the space evenly value. So changing the justify counter to space evenly. When I started using the Flexbox, I initially didn't understand the difference between these values. That's totally normal. You'll start understanding these values once you start using them in your projects. So setting the value to space evenly, you can see that the space between the flex items is evenly distributed on both the sides. The space between flex item 1 and flex item 2 is the same as the rest. So while space evenly ensures that the space between the items is always the same on both the sides, the space around makes sure that the space around each item is the same on the left and the right side. Definitely not a big difference, but the usages differ completely. There are two more values for the justify content property, the flex start and the flex end values. When the justify content is set to flex start, well, it is the default value. Let's uncomment the margin value to ensure that. Yes, it is the default value. Now, if we set the justify content to flex end, here I want your complete attention. People often confuse between row reverse and the flex end values. Row reverse will invert the order of the flex items, but the flex end value only moves the flex items to the end of the container, maintaining the margin if provided. Alright, the last property we are going to discuss in this video is the align items. The justify content property aligns the flex items along the main axis, but the align items property aligns the flex items along the cross axis. In order to make the align items property work, we are now going to make one of the flex items bigger than the rest. Because every flex item is having a unified height, so it will be difficult to demonstrate the align items property. We're going to pick the third item. And set its height to 150 pixels. Let's also change the justify content to center. And here it is. I'm just noticing an error with my nomenclature. I've included numbers for items which should have been for item. That's totally fine. Here you can see that all of flex items are now having a height of 150 pixels. And not just the flex item 3. That's not a bug, but it happens because the default value for align items is stretch. When the align item is set to stretch, this is what happens. So let's now set the align items to center. Alright, we can visualize how align items property align our flex items along the cross axis. Here we have one flex item that is bigger than the rest, and with the align items property set to center, we center the smaller flex items relative to the bigger one in the vertical fashion. If we now set the align items to flex start, all the items will stack to the top along the top of the bigger flex item. The opposite will happen if we set the align items to flex end. So the flex items are aligned equally at the bottom. So far we saw center, flex start, flex end, and the stretch values for the align items property. The stretch value tries to stretch the height of all the flex items to match the height of the tallest flex item. There's one last value for the align items property. It is called the baseline. To utilize the baseline value, we'll first have to increase the font size of one of the item. So let's select item number 4 and increase its font size to 70 pixels. If we now set the align items to baseline, you can see that it aligns all the flex items along the text inside the item number 4 on an imaginary line. I'm now going to reset align items to center and get rid of items number 4 and items number 3 selectors here. Alright, we're coming to the end of this video. So flex direction, justify content, and the align items are the most important and the frequently used properties. Of course, there are a few other properties, but we'll see them in another video. Before we end this video, I want to answer to one of the highest rated questions. What will happen to justify content and the align items property when the flex direction is set to column? Well, let's check that out. Great. If you notice, the main axis had changed now. It is no longer going from left to right, but it is going from top to bottom. Everything is fine, but why is that the items are aligned to the center yet? Well, that's due to align items is set to center and the flex direction is set to column. When the flex direction is set to column, the main axis would be the y-axis and the cross axis would be the x-axis. We know that the align items property affects the cross axis, and that's why our items are aligned at the center vertically. So if we now set the align items to flex end, and you can see that the items are aligned at the end of the container vertically. The opposite of this will happen if we set the align items to flex start. And yes, the items are stacked at the beginning of the container. So I would again emphasize you guys to always keep a track of the main axis and the cross axis in order to use the justify content and the align items in the right way. Now, for your better understanding, I'll also experiment with the justify content when the flex direction is set to column. For that, we should first set a height value for the container. So maybe let's set it to 1400 pixels. And then I'll decrease the size of my viewport. Now, let's set justify content to space between here. If I hover over the justify content on my DevTools, you can see that the space between the items are distributed just as we saw earlier, but in the vertical direction. Alright, let's end this video here. I know I'm leaving most of you with a skeptical mind, but that's totally normal for any beginner. I felt the same when I learned Flexbox for the first time, and that's why I made those beautiful cheat sheets for the reference purpose. I feel it would have been better if someone gave me those cheat sheets when I started learning Flexbox. You can now rewatch this video along with the cheat sheet so that you get a better clarity about these concepts. Let's quickly set the flex direction to row, remove the height, and set justify content and align items to center and end this video. Great. Let's meet back in the next lecture to learn more about the Flexbox concepts. In the last lecture, we learned 3 important Flexbox container properties. There are a few more, but we'll see them later. Now, in this video, let's learn about the Flexbox child properties. So, this is where we left in our last video. The first property we're going to learn in this lecture is the align self property. The align self property is similar to the align items property. With the help of align items property, we were able to collectively change the alignment of a flex items along the cross axis. But the align self property will align one single flex item along the cross axis, and it can also override the align items property. I know, it sounded like gobbledygook. Let's see them in action to understand how it works. To experiment the align self property, let's again create the item 3 selector and give it a height of 150 pixels. We're going to use item 3 as a reference point. So let's try applying align self to item number 4. Right after item number 3, we're going to create item number 4 selector and creating align self property here. Let's set this to flex start. Well, you can see that only item number 4 is aligned at the start of the flex container, and all of the flex items are aligned to the center of item 3 along the cross axis. Align self property accepts every single value that align items property accepts. But as I told you earlier, we use align self property only to align an individual item. Now, let's change this to flex end and see what happens. So the item had moved to the bottom of the flex container now. When align self is set a stretch, well, the item stretches to match the height of the tallest item, which is item 3 in our case. Now, I'll leave this to you guys. Go ahead and experiment the other possible values like center, space between, space evenly, space around, and try to analyze the use cases. Next up, we're going to play with the order of our flex items. The order property is used to change the position of flex items within the container. To experiment this property, we're going to create selectors for all our flex items and change their order. The initial value of order is 0. So according to Flexbox, the flex item 1 is in the 0th position. Let's set order property to every flex item and change the positions. So we're going to move item 1 to position 3, then item 2 to position 4, item 3 to position 0, item 4 to position 1, item 5 to position 2. So after saving the file, you can see our items are relocated. I want you guys to understand that these values I give here are just experimental values. You can go ahead and arrange the items as you wish. But again, I would encourage everyone to follow the order I'm giving here so that we can stay on the same track. If you see here, 1 is at 3rd position, 2 is at 4th position, 3 is at 0th position, 4 is at 1st position, and 5 is at 2nd position. The order property will be handy for us to relocate the position of the elements when it comes to responsive design. You can see some people using negative values to change the order, but I never encourage anyone to use negative values. That will confuse us when we look at our code in the future. That's all about the order property. We're now going to see the last 3 properties associated with the Flexbox child items. They are the flex grow, flex shrink, and the flex basis. I'd remove the order properties from all of flex items. We're first going to see the flex grow property now. The flex grow property enables a flex item to grow. To grow a flex item, all we do is specify an integer, just a number like how we assign to the order property. To experiment this property, let's apply generally in the item selector. So I'm going to create a flex grow property and set it to 1. Wow, all our flex items have become larger in size. So here, all our flex items are occupying the entire space that they can fit into the container. In other words, they're occupying the maximum space available inside the container. We can visualize this better if we again comment the margin property. You can see they're touching each other now and occupying all the space that they can. That's about the flex grow property. Let me uncomment this margin property now. So even if we change this 1 to 100, they're not going to get any bigger than this. That's because the value only matters in relation to the rest. Let's reset this value to 1 and try to understand how the value matters in relation with the other flex grow values. Let's add a flex grow property to item 4 and give it 3. So here, our item number 4 is 3 times bigger than the rest of the flex items. By this, I'm sure you can understand how the flex grow property works relatively. When I change this 3 to 5, it's going to become 5 times bigger than the other flex items. That's all about the flex grow property. Let's remove the flex grow property from item number 4 and discuss about a shorthand property. So the last 3 properties we are learning have a shorthand property to them. We can directly call them using the flex keyword. So with the flex keyword, we can declare 3 different values. The first value will be for a flex grow property, the second will be for flex shrink, and the last will be for flex basis. When we simply give only the first value, it will automatically understand that we're declaring the flex grow value. So if we remove the grow keyword from here, every flex item is still occupying the maximum space. This method is going to be extremely handy when it comes to real-world projects. And in most cases, we'll be using this shorthand property in our project. Maybe we want one of our flex items to grow larger than the rest. For example, let's try growing our last item. Now, setting flex 5 to item number 5, you can see that it is occupying the maximum space and the rest are relatively occupying the available space. This is all about the flex grow property. Next up, we're going to see the flex basis property. Flex basis property will set the width of a flex item. Instead of using the width property, we can use the flex basis. Using the flex basis property or the width property would mean the same. That's always a personal choice. But in my opinion, I would say it is always good to practice to use the flex basis property so that we'll be able to differentiate the flex item and the normal item. Now, for our example, I'm going to change this to flex basis and set this to 75%. When we're using the flex basis property, we should declare a percentage based value or a pixel based value. Now, the item number 5 is occupying 75% of the container and the rest are altered to occupy the remaining 25% space by setting the flex basis to auto in the background. Do not worry if you're not able to understand the difference between these properties. We're going to use them a lot in our course, so you'll eventually understand them out of practice. The very last property we're going to see in this video is flex shrink. So to show you guys what the flex shrink property does, let me change this percentage value to a pixel based value. Maybe let me change this to 700 pixels. Right. Let me also minimize my browser window to demonstrate this property. Now, if I decrease the viewport's width, just see what happens. So you can see that our item number 5 shrinks at a certain breakpoint. In spite of setting its flex basis to 700 pixels, it shrinks at a certain point. To avoid this, we declare the flex shrink property and set it to 0. There are only 2 values to the flex shrink property, 1 and 0. So it works as a binary property. By default, it is set to 1, which means it will shrink the flex item at a point. Let's now try setting the flex shrink property to 0 and see what happens. But before that, let me expand my browser window size. Going to my text editor, I'm going to set a flex shrink property to item number 5 and set it to 0. Now, if I try to decrease my browser window size, well, you can see that after setting flex shrink to 0, no matter how much size we take off from the viewport, the item number 5 is not shrinking, but the rest of the items are overflowing the viewport. In most cases, people ignore to understand that they're using the flex shrink property. In real time, we use the flex keyword where we can consecutively declare all three properties, flex grow, flex shrink, and the flex basis, where we only target the flex basis, aka the width property, to set the flex item's width. And that's how we'll be implementing in our course too. After watching this video, I highly encourage everyone to open up the cheat sheets and practice until this point. In the next video, we're going to learn the rest of the flex container properties and in this section. Before we end this section, I would like to teach you guys how to handle a lot of flex items into the flex container. So right now we have 5 flex items. Let's simply add another 5 flex items to our container and reset their class names. So you can see that all these flex items are closely packed to fit into the container, and some are overflowing the flex container. I've zoomed my browser to 150% for the demonstration purpose. If you don't find these items overflowing, simply zoom your browser window as I've did. Now, coming back to the point. We have this one last video for this section because we've got a solution if you find our flex items getting cramped up like this. So we can use the flex wrap property to overcome this issue. The default value for flex wrap is no wrap, and that's why our flex items are overflowing the container. But if we create a flex wrap property inside the container selector and set it to wrap, then this will create a new line like this to fit all the flex items inside the container. If in case we had a selector for item number 10 and set the flex to 1, you can see item number 10 is occupying its maximum space in the line. Now, if we shrink the browser size, then the flex wrap property will wrap the flex items more and more to ensure that all the flex items fit into the container. And once again, this is going to be extremely useful for the responsive design when we have less amount of space in the screen. Now, let me increase the height of the container here and show you guys what will happen. Maybe let's set this to 600 pixels and see what happens. So here we still have 2 rows, but why do we have this empty space in between? That's because of the align content property, which we haven't discussed yet. That's again a flex container property. So let's create an align content property into the container selector. And set it to flex start. Now, as you can see, every row in our flex container is at the top of the container. Therefore, the align content property aligns the row in the cross axis into the container. Again, we can use the same values for the align content property as we use for the align items and the align self property. Here, I want you guys to pause the video and analyze the difference between the align items, align self, and the align content properties. Now, let's set the align content to center. So, as you can see, our rows are aligned at the center of the container. We can also change this to flex end. And yes, the rows are at the end of the container. Then let's see the space around. Space between. And finally, the space evenly. So they all work in the same logic as you see. These properties will take some time for you to memorize. But you don't have to really worry about it because from now on, we're only going to use the Flexbox in our main project. Kudos to everyone. We've mastered the concept of Flexbox. Let's not waste any more time. We have got a beautiful app to be constructed inside our website. So I'll meet you guys in the next section where we'll be reconstructing a nav bar and the hero section, and then we'll move on to our app.